The final, brutal convergence of World War II was not a matter of sheer human will, but one of mathematics and metallurgy. A stark calculation of which industrial leviathan could first drown its foe in an avalanche of steel and lead. The spring of 1945 was the proving ground for this equation, the moment when two utterly disparate war machines, having chewed through the viscera of Central Europe, finally neared their ideological and logistical collision course. Near the frozen, muddy banks of the Oder River, the air tasted of pulverized concrete and burning pitch, a perpetual twilight sustained by the relentless artillery of the advancing Red Army. Lieutenant Anatoly Gromov, a man whose face had been weathered into a permanent grimace by 4 years of total war, did not see a triumphant advance. He saw a terrifying, unsustainable expenditure. His trench coat was a patchwork of German and Soviet wool, his rifle scavenged, and the boots on his feet were the only true spoils of war he had permitted himself to take. His existence, like that of every man around him, was predicated on the zero-sum equation of Soviet logistics. Every round fired, every kilometer gained, every meager ration eaten was either hauled on the back of a starving horse or seized brutally and immediately from the defeated territory, an act not of malice but of fundamental necessity. For Gromov's division, the daily caloric intake, if one discounted the occasional risky supplement of plundered livestock, stood at a grinding 1,909 calories, a testament to the fact that the Soviet war machine was fueled, first and foremost, by blood and momentum, by the ideological fervor to fight and the certainty of execution for failure, not by the systematic abundance of its industrial heartland, their tenuous supply line. Stretching thousands of miles back to the Urals was the very definition of scarcity, an iron fist wrapped in a threadbare cloth, relying on a thundering yet sporadic influx of Lend-Lease trucks to even maintain the bare minimum required for existence. He observed the shell-shocked face of a German boy, no older than 16, whose helmet lay discarded in the mud, and thought not of vengeance, but of the immense crushing weight of the next attack, knowing that victory would be paid for in flesh, not in fuel. 300 miles to the west, amidst the broken spires and rubble-strewn boulevards of a liberated Rhineland town, the reality was utterly, cosmically different. Sergeant Frank Lefty Costello, a transport section veteran from Detroit, stood casually amidst a German warehouse, his face lit by the arc light he had commandeered and plugged into the town's miraculously intact electrical grid. Costello was surrounded not by necessity, but by a staggering, grotesque surplus. Rolls of pristine German telephone wire lay beside unopened crates of American sea rations. 3,400 calories per man, per day, every day, stacked so high they threatened to topple. Behind him sat his 5-ton truck, its gas tank brimming with high-octane American gasoline, a single vehicle consuming more in 1 week than an entire Soviet rifle company's annual allocation. This was the logistical avalanche of material wealth, the silent weapon of the Western Allies. The American war was a war of unapologetic abundance, where the very notion of scarcity was a foreign concept, a historical curiosity read about in a dusty book. The logistics of the United States Army required that every man be provisioned with, on average, 24 pounds of supplies daily. A monstrous figure that included everything from fuel and ammunition to clean uniforms and cigarettes. Their tanks did not seize fuel, they spilled it. Their men did not starve, they discarded excess food. It was this unlimited resource base that created a structural restraint, a buffer against the brutality that scarcity mandates. The American soldier didn't need to plunder to survive. He was an agent of an industrial machine that provided 24 pounds of supply per day, every day, without fail. The simple, visceral sensory descriptions. that defined the American existence, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the roar of a perfectly maintained engine, the rhythmic sound of a supply convoy stretching back to the Atlantic, were the unmistakable signs of a war machine operating on a plane of existence the Axis and the Soviets alike could neither comprehend nor counter. The ultimate cold truth of the conflict, the definitive thesis-defining statement that settled the outcome long before the final shots were fired, was that victory would be determined not by the tenacity of the soldier, but by the relentless geometric superiority of the factory. The war would be won not by courage alone, but by the side that could churn out a stupefying, unimaginable 800,000 tons of steel every single week. That number alone was the POW mathematics of defeat for anyone who stood against it. The terrifying reality for the Soviet fighting man or woman was not merely the German military machine across the line, but the unforgiving, ever-present machinery of the state at their back. Long before the spring of 1945, the ideological terror had been codified, cementing the notion that existence itself was a zero-sum political equation. To be captured was not simply a misfortune of war. It was, by Soviet decree, specifically Order No. 270 of August 1941, an act of potential treason, placing a crushing, impossible, ideological burden upon the victim. The motherland, the Rodina, did not recognize prisoners. It recognized only heroes who fought to the last breath, or traitors who surrendered, and there was no middle ground for the suffering in between. This political framework, born of scarcity and totalitarian paranoia, ensured that Soviet women who entered the service, often as nurses, medics, or communication specialists, faced a double jeopardy. The physical peril of the Eastern Front, compounded by the certainty that, should they fall into enemy hands, their survival would be interpreted not as an act of resilience, but as contamination and complicity. The German perspective, though equally monstrous, was rooted in a fundamentally different kind of scarcity, the pragmatic, desperate need for human thermodynamics. As the war ground into its final phase, the German Wehrmacht, bled dry of manpower and resources, viewed the millions of Soviet citizens caught in its grip, the Ostarbeiter, the forced laborers, and the women captured near the lines, not through a lens of racial hatred alone, but through an immediate logistical imperative. They were designated as Hilfswillige or Hiwis, a vast, shadowy, and ideologically inconvenient auxiliary force. These women were deployed for the thankless, grinding tasks of the war, cooking for garrisons, laundering uniforms, moving stores, and performing basic clerical work near the rear echelon. The German High Command saw them as easily replaceable units of caloric energy, whose daily existence was calculated on an unforgiving ledger. The minimum amount of food required to keep them operational, measured against the maximum amount of manual labor they could provide. Their survival was a simple, cold act of economics, a temporary disposable fix for the German logistic collapse, a way to free up valuable German fighting men for the front. The German system thus viewed the Soviet female prisoner as a resource, a calorie-consuming, exploitable unit of labor, a commodity of low-cost human expenditure. This transactional material view created a nexus of profound vulnerability. Positioned near the front, these women were exposed to the worst of the German brutality, yet simultaneously faced the terrifying certainty of the Soviet reaction should the Red Army sweep back over them. They lived in a double bindee, coerced into German service to survive starvation, yet knowing that service, even forced kitchen work, would be interpreted by the NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, as collaboration. The Soviet political machine could not afford the moral complexity of victimhood. It demanded ideological purity, and the survival of a Soviet asset in German custody suggested that the enemy had managed to taint the essence of the socialist citizen. If the fascist foe did not destroy her, then she must have destroyed her own political soul by surviving. She was no longer a victim of the German advance. She was a contaminated asset, a political time bomb whose experiences abroad were a stain on the collective narrative of resilience. This juxtaposition of ideological and logistical degradation established the base level of expectation for every Soviet woman found in German custody in 1945. Whether viewed as an economic unit by the Germans or as a potential traitor by their own government, their bodies and their fates were subject to the whims of men in uniform and the cold calculations of total war. This pervasive, somber acknowledgement of the human cost, this preparation for the worst form of human depravity, is the absolute foundation upon which the shock of the eventual American interaction would be built. The subsequent events would only carry meaning because of the utter structural despair that was the zero-sum reality of the Soviet woman under the Third Reich. The true sound of the American advance was not the thunderclap of the artillery barrage, but the rhythmic, unending pulse of the diesel engine, a mechanical heartbeat resonating from the wharves of New York to the shattered plains of Europe, signifying a no industrial supremacy narrative that rendered the notion of logistical failure an administrative impossibility. This was the unstoppable avalanche of material, a torrent so vast, so geometrically overwhelming, that it created a structural environment of unapologetic military abundance, fundamentally altering the human calculus of warfare. The American soldier, the GI, was not merely a combatant. He was an agent of the most lavish, prolific, and terrifying industrial machine the world had ever conceived. A machine whose very existence precluded the savage necessities that drove the Eastern and Axis fronts toward moral collapse. To speak of the Points-T Lend-Lease program, Bombays, in mere monetary terms, is to misunderstand its physical, visceral impact. It was not a bank account, but a colossal transfer of kinetic energy, a movement of matter that provided the structural foundation for global resistance and, ultimately, for the American soldier's capacity for restraint. Its manifestation was concrete, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. 400,000 purpose-built trucks, predominantly the ubiquitous Studebaker and GMC models, which provided the only reliable mobility for the Red Army's vast, threadbare supply columns. 13,000 industrial-grade locomotives, and Bayan 123,000. Railway cars, rebuilding the shattered European infrastructure as quickly as the American engineers advanced, and the constant, relentless passage of 630 oil tankers, delivering the lifeblood of modernity, oil, in quantities that dwarfed the combined production of the German Reich. This constant rhythmic surge of material was the silent guarantee of the American command. This guarantee translated into a daily reality that was cognitively dissonant for any adversary. The American fighting man was provided with a staggering average of 24 pounds of supply per day. Every day, without fail. This was not a lean ration designed for survival, but a calculated overhead meant for comfort, efficiency, and relentless operational tempo. It included not only his 3,400 calories of preserved food, but also high-grade aviation fuel for the machines overhead, replacement parts for the trucks below, clean water, and the small, crucial psychological comforts like cigarettes and chocolate bars. The American soldier didn't need to plunder to survive. He only needed to consult his quartermaster, who himself was backed by the inexhaustible production of American factories that churned out 1,900,000 rifles and carbines and 7 million baffled. tons of general cargo shipping. This structural wealth, this constant, predictable flow of abundance, served as the ultimate moral guardrail, removing the primal desperation that often fuels atrocities. The very design philosophy of American equipment reflected this boundless luxury, earning the derision of their more resource-conscious enemies. German airmen famously mocked the P-47 Thunderbolt, calling it the Hilfswillige, flying milk bottle, a nickname intended to denote its corpulence, its heavy, over-engineered frame, and its sheer size, which stood in stark contrast to the sleek, economical lines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But the P-47 was only corpulent because it was built from an unlimited aluminum supply, and it carried 50 caliber machine guns capable of spewing 6,000 rounds of ammunition every minute, and its weight was the price of a massive, supercharged engine that ran on a limitless torrent of 100-octane aviation fuel. Oh, the derision quickly transformed into existential dread, the irony becoming a source of terror. The seemingly crude, over-engineered American design was merely a visible manifestation of an unbridgeable industrial gap. The German pilot had to worry about running out of fuel or ammunition. The American pilot only had to worry about finding more targets. The American supply chain, a logistical colossus stretching back to a peaceful and productive home front, whispered its silent, undeniable truth to the soldier in the field and the captive behind enemy lines. We have enough, and tomorrow we will have more. This was the revelatory power of of the supply line, the unwritten contract that allowed the American military command to demand institutional restraint. Knowing that the soldier's basic needs, the very things that necessitate plunder in a time of scarcity, were not only met, but were being actively, systematically glutted by the mathematics of abundance. The geographical and humanitarian crucible of the spring of 1945 was not the front line itself, but the chaotic, sprawling refugee landscape left in the wake of the retreating Wehrmacht, the burgeoning and dreadful reality of the displaced persons or DP crisis. As the Allied armies, both East and West, sliced through the remnants of the Third Reich, they liberated not only territory, but a staggering 7 million human beings, a desperate multinational tide of humanity swept up by years of forced migration, slavery, and extermination. This human freight, encompassing every nationality from Polish farmhands and French prisoners to Soviet forced laborers, transformed the final act of the war from a purely military campaign into an immediate, complex challenge of immense administrative and moral judgment. This was a profound protocol shock for the American soldier who had previously understood war through the clean, brutal lines of the Pacific or the desert expanse of North Africa. Now, victory meant assuming immediate responsibility for the lives, health, and political fate of millions, a mission for which the American machine was logistically prepared, but morally and administratively challenged. At the heart of this collision lay the repatriation mission, a bureaucratic mandate born from wartime agreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. These DPs were not simply victims, they were political currency, and their sorting required the immediate establishment of vast ad hoc compounds, the DP camps, which became the accidental meeting points for utterly contrasting ideological systems. For the Americans, the official policy, driven by the principles of individual liberty and the rule of law, was one of methodical protective processing. Every Soviet citizen found was to be treated as a victim, afforded shelter, food, and medical care, with their ultimate disposition handled through formal channels. The American forces had strict, detailed orders regarding the hard protection and processing of DPs. creating a systemic demand for modern institutional restraint that flowed directly from the logistical abundance of the supply lines. They could afford to be humane because the system was not desperate. Yet, lurking just behind the American relief efforts was the POW somber acknowledgement of the imminent Soviet arrival, specifically the Soviet repatriation mission. Teams. This was the moment where the Soviet and American administrative systems ceased to be parallel and began to violently intersect. For the Soviets, the mission was simple, brutal, and immediate. Reclaim every citizen, regardless of their wishes. There was no complex processing, no compassionate consideration of individual experience. Only the iron law of the totalitarian state, demanding the return of its property. For the Soviet women, many of whom had been forced into service as hiwis or captured near the front lines, the arrival of the American liberators provided only a temporary, fragile sanctuary. They were acutely aware that the American effort to treat them as free individuals, as persons requiring protection, was a fleeting interlude before the unforgiving certainty of the Soviet system took hold. The scene in these camps was a constant juxtaposition of scales, the American soldier chewing gum surrounded by a machifon, embarrassment of canned goods and fresh cigarettes, meticulously following a 6-page protocol on handling of nationals of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, contrasted with the gaunt multilingual mass of humanity who understood that the difference between freedom and the Gulag rested on the interpretation of a single political decree. This was the POW, crossroads of liberation, a place where the American commitment to due process and the overwhelming supply of material collided head-on with the Soviet doctrine of political suspicion and the terrifying inherent scarcity of moral latitude that defined its system. The protocols the American soldier was following, orders requiring the humane separation of sexes, the provision of clean water, and the detailed logging of names, were baffling in their administrative luxury. They were demands for restraint and precision that could only be issued by an army that was not fighting for survival, but for the imposition of an order born of plenty. For the Soviet women caught in this geopolitical vice, the American approach of strict, if distant courtesy would be the first profound shock to a worldview shaped entirely by deprivation, violence, and the ultimate zero-sum equation of their lives under both the German and Soviet flags. The narrative, which had previously tracked the relentless flow of steel and the cold calculus of political decree, now abruptly narrows to a single, human-scaled moment of overwhelming tension, the climax at the midpoint, that would fundamentally prove the thesis of industrial supremacy. It was late April 1945, the air in this forgotten corner of Saxony thick with the scent of pine needles and distant cordite. The location was a dilapidated, isolated German Arbeitslager, a labor camp, a cluster of rough wooden barracks tucked precariously close to a deteriorating railway siding. The character anchor for this profound moment was Maria, a Soviet former Hiwi translator from Kiev, a woman whose intelligence had been sharpened into a blade of pure, pragmatic cynicism by 4 years spent navigating the moral abyss between the German logistical machine and the Soviet political terror. Gaunt, her clothes thin and ill-fitting, she stood pressed against the splintered wood of a washhouse, listening to the cacophony of the German retreat. She was not praying for liberation. She was calculating the odds of immediate survival. The silence that followed the sudden panicked flight of the German guards, a motley collection of elderly men and injured youths who fled towards the sanctuary of the deeper woods, was heavier than the preceding noise. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy tires grinding gravel, followed by the distinctive idling purr of a large, perfectly maintained American engine, a sound so rich and resonant it spoke of oil fields and assembly lines that knew no shortage. Sergeant Frank Lefty Costello's forward scouting element, 2 heavily armed jeeps bearing the dust and grime of the recent offensive, rolled slowly into the clearing. The 5 Soviet women who had been hiding in the cellar, women whose existence had been reduced to the brutal simplicity of caloric input and physical endurance, emerged slowly, blinking in the late afternoon sun. Starved but intensely focused. Maria took 2 steps out into the dirt, her body language radiating a profound ingrained expectation of the inevitable. Every moment of her life under the Reich and every piece of political knowledge she carried from the Soviet Union had taught her one iron law. Power, in its immediate, victorious form, expresses itself through child seizure, plunder, and violation. The German guards, the Russian collaborators, the Soviet officers who viewed their own women as contaminated property, they all adhered to this single, universal law of scarcity. When you possess the strength, you take what you desire, particularly the most vulnerable human commodity. Maria's mind was a whirlwind of visceral sensory descriptions. Preparing for the encounter, she was ready for the drunken shout, the rough hand, the immediate demand for currency, jewelry, or her very person. She was prepared for the zero-sum transaction that had defined her entire war experience. But the reality that unfolded was counterintuitive, ironic, and, to Maria's cynical mind, utterly baffling. The American soldiers, Costello, a large man with a helmet tipped back, and his driver, a young man with a spotless uniform, did not look at the women. They leapt from their jeeps, not with predatory hunger, but with clinical professional discipline. Costello's first action was not to search the women, but to methodically secure the perimeter, checking the corners of the barracks for mines or stragglers. The second American soldier immediately began setting up a radio antenna, his gaze fixed on his wristwatch. This was the moment of dramatic tension. The core of the revelation. The immediate, ingrained expectation of sexual violence or plunder, born from years under 2 resource-starved totalitarian regimes, was met with a total, absolute negative. The soldiers were not driven by the primal necessities of the front. They were driven by the operational necessity of their orders. "We got 5 female DPs," Costello announced into his radio handset, his voice devoid of any particular emotion, merely relaying a checklist item. "Need a medic and rations? And tell supply we're still 45 minutes out from the rendezvous point. I need that fuel truck on time." Maria watched, utterly stunned, as the young driver pulled a package of cigarettes from his pristine pocket, lit one, and then, with a casual gesture, tossed the entire pack to the ground near the women, an act of such casual, abundant waste that it defied the very logic of scarcity she had been operating under. The irony was devastating. American soldiers were more concerned with securing their scheduled supply drop, the punctual delivery of the SOI industrial avalanche, than with taking advantage of the desperate humans standing before them. Their attention was not on the women's bodies, but on the all logistics of abundance. The American system was simply too rich, too well-oiled, and too administratively disciplined to permit the crime. The immediate aftermath of the liberation was defined by an ironic, counterintuitive scenario that constituted the core revelation of American structural supremacy, proving the thesis that logistics, not morality alone, governed conduct. Having prepared themselves for the rough hand, the immediate demand, the inevitable, violent transaction that defines life under scarcity, the Soviet women were instead confronted with a phenomenon so alien to their lived experience that it produced a state of psychological disorientation, the shock of the negative. The American soldiers, having secured the perimeter and made the necessary radio calls, now turned their attention to the human freight. but their actions were utterly divorced from the transactional violence that Maria and the others had internalized. The first objects offered were not weapons or demands, but routine, unnecessary goods. An entire carton of palm-olive soap, a POW, a box of individual wrapped Dion ration biscuits, and a tin of Key Lucky Strike cigarettes. Dumb. These items, which to a survivor of the Soviet and German scarcity economies represented staggering unspendable wealth, a unit of currency more valuable than gold, were, to Sergeant Costello's platoon, simply aus expendable inventory. The sheer casual abundance was itself a psychological weapon. Maria watched a young American private, oblivious to the profound significance of his action, absent-mindedly discard a half-eaten can of processed meat, a single item that contained more protein than she had consumed in the previous week, because he found the taste boring. This was a statistical reveal made visceral and agonizingly clear. The daily waste marks of the American Army, the thousands of half-eaten cans, the discarded gallons of high-octane fuel left to evaporate on the ground, represented a logistical volume that often exceeded the total monthly rations allocated to a front-line Soviet rifle division or the entire fuel supply of a beleaguered German panzer unit. The American soldier, saturated in the unlimited resources of his industrial state, simply lacked the primal impetus for plunder. The women were not seen as objects of necessity or gain because the GI's most basic needs, food, warmth, comfort, and immediate psychological gratification, were already being glutted by a logistical machine of unimaginable scale. The American Army was too rich to need to rape. This abundance created a cognitive barrier, a profound lack of motivation for the kind of immediate, savage seizure that is, born of deprivation. Why risk a career, a court-martial, or a fight for a few rubles or a moment of conquest when one's own duffel bag contained endless cigarettes, plentiful rations, and a fresh change of clothes, all guaranteed by the rhythmic arrival of the next supply convoy? The simple act of providing soap, an item utterly foreign to the desperate final phases of the Eastern Front, was a profound demonstration of the American machine's philosophy. Cleanliness and comfort were not luxuries, but military necessities. This was the ultimate POW irony. The restraint was not born of superior personal morality, but of superior logistics. The American soldier did not lack desire, but he lacked the point necessity that drives transgression, and he was held in check by a system that provided more than he could consume. The Americans' lack of immediate interest in the Soviet women, their focus instead on the map coordinates and the precise delivery of the next tank of fuel, spoke volumes. This was an army operating on a level of technical industrial supremacy, where human hunger and primal need had been systematically removed from the operational equation. The American war was one fought with a full stomach and a full fuel tank, and that single, simple distinction defined the chasm between the two forces. For Maria, the sight of an American soldier casually tossing away a full stick of gum was more shocking than any scream. It meant she was now in the orbit of a power that operated on a logic completely outside the brutal, zero-sum mathematics of scarcity she had always known. The FLANAM, mathematics of abundance, had inadvertently produced a momentary profound act of grace, a shocking demonstration that their machine was simply too oversupplied to engage in the crime of necessity. The phenomenon observed at the labor camp, the casual provision of soap and the baffling lack of plunder, was not the result of spontaneous virtue, but a powerful demonstration of institutional restraint, a legal and disciplinary framework afforded only by an army of logistical certainty. The American Army, for all its boisterousness and individual flaws, operated under a detailed and often merciless system of internal justice, a vast bureaucratic counterweight to the anarchy of combat. This system, embodied by the untold Articles of War and the omnipresent specter of the court-martial, stood in stark, almost incomprehensible contrast to the immediate life-or-death decision-making that characterized the Eastern Front, where the law was often synonymous with the whims of a political commissar or the sheer desperation of a starving unit. For the Soviet soldier, moral constraints often dissolved under the pressure of structural scarcity and the implicit ideological permission to brutalize the enemy and their resources. But for the American GI, every action, even in the chaos of victory, was subject to review by a chain of command obsessed with the notion of conduct unbecoming. This was the great silent deterrent, a legal machine designed not primarily for moral hygiene, but to protect the operational integrity and diplomatic reputation of the Army of the Republic. The ability to maintain such a rigorous legal and disciplinary structure was, in itself, a luxury afforded by the stability of the industrial backbone. An army that does not have to worry about its next meal or its next round of ammunition can afford to worry about its international image and the legal precision of its internal processes. The American soldier, unlike his counterpart in the Red Army, knew that sexual violence or indiscriminate plunder was not merely a moral failure but a prosecutable offense, one that could swiftly remove him from the abundance of the forward supply line and plunge him into the rigid, unforgiving world of military prison. This preoccupation with administrative detail was bewildering to the Europeans, but it was an essential operational requirement for a global power projecting its force across oceans. American officers constantly reminded of the political need to manage the displaced persons crisis and adhere to the Geneva Conventions, hammered home the message not through appeals to abstract morality, but through the threat of definitive, irreversible punishment. One can almost hear the composite, authoritative voice of the American command echoing through the field manuals. You have been provided with every ounce of material necessary to execute your mission. Any reliance on seizure, any abuse of civilian personnel, or any infraction of the Articles of War will be dealt with severely. Discipline over desire is the price of our professionalism, and failure to comply risks both the mission and the integrity of this entire force. This emphasis on institutional order ensured that the individual moment of human weakness was contained by the larger impersonal structure of military law. The court-martial was a legal system designed to be slow, methodical, and profoundly terrifying to the individual soldier. It represented a political certainty that stood in direct opposition to the chaos they were fighting in. This framework, supported by the immense financial and logistical capability to deploy provost marshals and dedicated military police units, ensured that the rules were not suggestions, but commands enforced by genuine power. The system was powerful because it could afford to be. It had the time, the resources, and the manpower to prosecute every serious infraction. Therefore, the lack of violence exhibited by Sergeant Costello's platoon toward Maria and the other women was not a spontaneous moral victory, but a logistical certainty enforced by law. It was the predictable behavioral outcome of placing well-fed, well-regulated men under a comprehensive legal code, backed by the unlimited punitive and provisioning power of the industrial state. The abundance of their supply line ensured their survival, and the severity of their legal code ensured their adherence to protocol, transforming the potential for savagery into an act of institutional restraint. This was the true, unsung power of the American advance. The brief, baffling interlude of American abundance was always destined to be a fleeting moment, a temporary, fragile sanctuary built upon a supply chain that stretched across an ocean. The real war, The ideological struggle that transcended mere military victory was about to reclaim its subjects, replacing the logic of institutional restraint with the zero-sum calculus of state paranoia. Chep. The atmosphere, which had been characterized by the distant, paternalistic order of Sergeant Costello's platoon, now transformed into a palpable dread, a profound shift marked by the rumble of different, older, and far more sparsely maintained trucks approaching the camp. This was the POW somber conclusion. To the women's temporary freedom, the arrival of the POW, Soviet repatriation mission. This was not a mission of rescue. It was a mission of reclamation, often led by units of the Parkna Enkis RD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the feared security apparatus of the Soviet state. The men who emerged from the dusty, battle-scarred vehicles were a stark contrast to the well-fed, well-equipped Americans. Their uniforms were utilitarian, their expressions were hard, and their focus was immediate and unyielding. They brought with them not the copious supplies of a victorious industrial power, but the necessary tools of the totalitarian state. Interrogation forms, clipboards, and the cold, unblinking authority of the political commissar. The moment their boots hit the ground, the very air seemed to constrict, the previous atmosphere of safety dissolving into the tense buildup of political inevitability. Maria and the other Soviet women understood instinctively that their temporary reprieve was over. The American soldier might have provided blankets, sea rations, and a baffling non-transactional courtesy. But the Soviet state provided only one thing: the verdict of the motherland. Bound by the Yalta agreements, complex diplomatic knots tied at the highest level of government that superseded the individual moral compass, Sergeant Costello and his men could only watch. Their duty was to prevent disorder and ensure the orderly transfer of Soviet citizens to Soviet authority. The American, a man accustomed to fixing problems with the sheer weight of logistical power, was rendered utterly impotent by the invisible wall of political protocol. He could deploy a Howon-Bo, 5-ton truck marmol of rations, but he could not deploy a single man to defy the international agreements that mandated this heartbreaking exchange. The POW juxtaposition of scales was never starker. The Americans, still concerned with the precise logistics of their next fuel drop, offered final cigarettes. These Soviet officers, viewing the camp through the lens of ideological contamination, immediately began the process of separating the women and demanding names and details of their capture. The Soviet system could not comprehend, and therefore could not tolerate, the ambiguity of a Soviet citizen who had spent years in contact with the enemy, even as a forced laborer. Survival in German captivity was, in the rigid eyes of the NKVD, itself suspicious. Why had the fascists allowed them to live? The NKVD's questions focused relentlessly on contact, collaboration, and confession. Interpreting every instance of non-brutality as potential proof of ideological failure, this focused, terrifying interrogation revealed the profound, unspoken irony that was the final betrayal of the women's struggle, the very lack of physical violation. And plunder by the American soldiers, the single greatest shock they had experienced, could now be twisted by the NKVD into POW, evidence of collaboration. If the capitalist enemy had not raped or stolen from them, it must be because they had somehow won the enemy's favor. The American soldier's accidental virtue, a byproduct of his industrial wealth and legal constraints, was now a damning piece of circumstantial evidence in the unforgiving machinery of the Soviet state. Maria, watching the Soviet officers unfold their paper forms, knew that the relative comfort of the last few days had not saved them. It had merely provided the final, dangerous political stain. They were trading a temporary physically safe custody for a terrifying permanent political sentence. The curtain of iron logic, the logic of scarcity and suspicion, was descending, and the American industrial avalanche could do nothing but observe. The brief, fragile sanctuary of American protection gave way to the implacable ideological granite of the Soviet state. Maria and the other women, having been transferred from the organized, though detached, custody of the American military, now faced the unforgiving machinery of repatriation. A system built not on relief, but on suspicion. The moment the NKVD officers assumed command, the nature of their ordeal changed completely. The focus shifted from their physical suffering to their ideological purity. The Soviet system, operating on the foundational principle of scarcity and political terror, simply could not comprehend and therefore could not permit the idea of an ideological enemy treating Soviet citizens with anything other than absolute depravity. This structural inability to recognize mercy as a possible behavior of the capitalist West formed the basis of the women's inevitable condemnation. The NKVD interrogators, fueled by a relentless paranoia and the codified legal doctrine of Order Number 270, began their work with a terrifying precision, searching not for evidence of forced labor, but for evidence of ideological consent. They found the women's accounts of American conduct bewildering and deeply incriminating. Why, the officers demanded, had the American soldiers not raped them? Why had they given them food without forcing them into perpetual labor? Why had they provided soap and clean blankets, items of such value they were often considered contraband, without demanding a transactional price? The very tatre, institutional restraint, that had baffled Maria in the German labor camp was now the most damning aspect of her history. The lack of violence, the absence of the savage, expected plunder, was interpreted not as a testament to the American system, but as proof of a secret, advantageous arrangement between the women and the enemy. The purity of the American motive, an accidental byproduct of their logistical avalanche of material wealth, was twisted into the ultimate deceit. It was argued that only collaboration, only the active betrayal of socialist principles could have earned such benign treatment from the avaricious Western capitalist. The women were not welcomed home as victims, broken but resilient. They were processed, judged, and condemned as traitors, ideologically tainted by contact with the West. Every material comfort received, the excessive 3,400 calories. Of the sea rations, the high-quality medical attention, the simple, staggering gift of an entire pack of American cigarettes, became a visible, physical mark of their political contamination. The Soviet state required its victims to be unequivocally victimized. The suggestion of any comfort or normalcy while under enemy influence was unacceptable to the narrative of total, righteous suffering. The final, brutal statistics of this profound ideological cruelty serve as the definitive, data-supported conclusion to their story. Of the hundreds of thousands of Soviet female citizens, be they prisoners of war, nurses, or forced laborers who were delivered back to Soviet authority, a staggering, overwhelming percentage, far exceeding 80% what in many records, were immediately subjected to severe judicial scrutiny, and countless numbers were funneled directly into the Gulag Archipelago for terms of 25 years or more for alleged treason or collaboration. This relentless, punitive application of the law demonstrated the ultimate revelation, the unintentional kindness of the American soldier. That act of non-violation born directly from the inexhaustible flow of the POW industrial engine was, in the unforgiving, paranoid machinery of totalitarianism, a final, catastrophic betrayal. The structural abundance of the West ultimately provided the Soviet state with the final, horrifying piece of evidence it needed to destroy its own citizens. The narrative of the Soviet women and the American GIs, played out in the brief, desperate sanctuary of a forgotten German labor camp, was not a mere footnote of human compassion, nor was it an anomaly of war. It was, instead, a microcosm of the fundamental, unbridgeable chasm between two emergent world orders, a singular event that encapsulated the very structural supremacy that would define the Cold War for the next 40 years. The temporary failure of the bingo zero-sum equation of totalitarianism. In the face of the POW logistics of abundance, proved that the ideological struggle would ultimately be settled not in the purity of political doctrine, but in the relentless, overwhelming output of the factory floor. The Soviet system, having consumed its own citizens and stripped the landscape bare in a desperate, valiant, and brutally successful fight for survival, was structurally dependent on fear, scarcity, and the belief that the individual exists solely to serve the state. Its survival mandated an economy of human cost, where every ration, every round, and every moral action was a calculated expenditure born of grinding necessity. This scarcity was the wellspring of its internal terror, the very force that transformed the liberated Soviet woman from a victim into a traitor, incapable of comprehending the possibility of non-transactional mercy. Arrayed against this logic was the American machine, fueled by an unfathomable torrent of oil, steel, and grain, a power so immense that its logistical waste, the gallons of spilled fuel, the mountains of half-eaten sea rations, the excess capacity of its industrial output, exceeded the annual production of its adversaries. The American soldier was the beneficiary and the accidental ambassador of this boundless wealth. The restraint exhibited by those few American soldiers, the baffling, non-plundering provision of soap and cigarettes, was not, at its core, a testament to a spontaneously superior character. It was the inevitable, predictable behavioral outcome of superior logistics and institutional design. It was the simple truth that the machine was simply too rich to permit the crime of necessity. This was the mathematics of destruction applied to human conduct. An army whose supply lines guaranteed an overabundance of resources simultaneously created the conditions for the enforcement of a rigorous, punitive legal code. The two, abundance and order, were inextricably linked, a structural certainty that removed the primal human impetus for atrocity. That single, simple fact that the American GI could be more concerned with the punctual arrival of his next convoy than with seizing what was before him foretold the final outcome of the looming ideological struggle. The subsequent decades of the Cold War would become a long, drawn-out demonstration of this fundamental chasm. The Soviet Union would strain its system to build a military parity, pouring its meager surplus into steel and rockets, but it could never replicate the pervasive wealth, comfort, and consumer liberty that flowed from the American industrial base. It could never escape the POW logic of scarcity that mandated repression and internal suspicion. The era of pure industrial supremacy had begun, a triumph rooted not just in the atomic bomb or the speed of a jet fighter, but in the mundane, staggering ability to provide 24 pounds of supply. To every soldier, every single day. The fate of the world was sealed in the realization that the system that could afford to be humane, even accidentally, was the system destined to endure. The story of the Russian women was the ultimate, somber proof. Totalitarianism could defeat armies, but it could not defeat an avalanche of logistical wealth.